Hey everyone, this is Six Path Weeb, and I'm excited to welcome you all to my YouTube channel. Today, we're diving into an exciting fanfic topic. What if a female Deku had a transmutation quirk? Disclaimer, the content on this channel is purely for entertainment and discussion purposes. I do not own any of the anime footage used in my videos, all rights and credits go to their respective creators and copyright holders. Now, let's jump right in. A blonde-haired child with wild, unruly locks crashed into a hard surface, bouncing off and skidding across the pavement. Before she even had time to process the pain, rough fingers wrapped around her throat, lifting her off the ground. Katsuki Bakugo's crimson eyes widened in shock as he struggled to breathe, a strangled gasp escaping her lips. The impact had already knocked the wind out of her, and now, with a firm grip tightening around her neck, her lungs burned desperately for air. The attacker, though still a child, was older, around 12. He had dark, messy hair, a sharp face, and an average build. His eyes gleamed with cruelty as he sneered. "Where do you think you're going, brat?" he growled, squeezing tighter. Rather than fear or panic, Katsuki's fiery gaze burned with anger. She clenched her teeth, growling low in her throat. In the distance, a frightened voice called out. "Kachan." The shout was small, trembling with concern. The older boy ignored it, but Katsuki's rage flared. She could endure this, but her timid best friend, Midoriya Decali, couldn't. She didn't want Decali caught up in this, didn't want her to suffer the same pain. She struggled, raising both hands to claw at the attacker's arms, thrashing wildly in an attempt to break free. But her efforts only made him chuckle, amused by how powerless she seemed. Then, something inside her snapped. Her hands stilled in the air, fingers trembling as she let out a furious scream. Explode! For a split second, sweat bubbled on her palm before bursting into a violent explosion. The blast wasn't strong enough to cause serious injury, but the shock and blinding light sent the older boy stumbling back. Katsuki fell to the ground, coughing, while her attacker gripped his eyes, groaning in pain. "Kachan!" That same frantic voice echoed again, followed by the sound of running footsteps. Katsuki barely had time to react before Decali barreled forward. Her small body charged toward the older boy, but something was different. Her arm had transformed, metallic, rugged, resembling the thick bars of rebar used in construction. With a determined cry, the 4-year-old slammed her hardened fist into the attacker's side, striking his liver with surprising force. The boy gasped, doubling over in pain. "Let's go," Decali shouted, motioning frantically. Still stunned, not just by her own quirk but also by Decali's, Katsuki hesitated for only a moment before scrambling to her feet. The two girls bolted, sprinting away before their attacker could recover. It took several minutes, but they finally reached Decali's home. Neither of them had stopped running, too afraid to look back. The second their adrenaline faded, their legs gave out, and they collapsed on the floor, gasping for breath. For a while, they sat there, panting in silence. Then, Decali spoke up, her voice filled with sheer excitement. "Kachan! Your quirk manifested." Her green eyes sparkled with joy, beaming at her best friend. Katsuki puffed out her chest proudly, flashing a grin. "TCH. Yours did too. And you're the one who knocked him flat on his butt." Decali blinked, a look of realization dawning on her face. "I did?" Katsuki rolled her eyes. Trust Decali, the biggest hero fan in existence, not to notice that she had just taken her first step toward her dream. "Look at your arm, dummy." Decali hesitated, then slowly looked down. Her breath hitched. Her arm, her entire forearm, was no longer flesh and bone. It had transformed completely into thick, heavy rebar. The rugged steel extended just below her elbow, her fingers now jointed metal instead of soft skin. She flexed her fingers experimentally. The metal groaned as it moved, her fingers responding stiffly, curling at a slow, deliberate pace. A look of shock crossed her face. She had done it. She had finally manifested her quirk. She spun around sharply, adrenaline once again rushing through her veins as she sprinted up the steps, momentarily forgetting her friend. With a burst of excitement, she slammed her hand against the door, metal clanking against wood as she knocked frantically. Midoriya Inko opened the door almost instantly, a green-haired woman approaching her 30s. She looked slightly irritated at the unexpected disturbance, but the moment her eyes landed on her daughter, her expression completely changed. She gasped, taking in Decali's outstretched metallic hand, and in the next instant, she launched forward, wrapping her into a tight embrace. Tears of joy streamed down her fair cheeks. "My baby!" She squealed, her voice filled with overwhelming pride. You did it. I did it. Dekali cheered, her voice high with excitement. Inko lifted her off the ground, holding her tightly against her chest. Happy tears welled up in Dekali's bright green eyes as she clung to her mother. Inko pulled back slightly, giving her a wide grin despite the tears still glistening on her face. You know what that means, Dekali? She asked playfully. I'm going to be a hero. Dekali squealed again, her enthusiasm boundless. Inko hugged her tightly once more, laughing softly. Standing nearby, Bakugo watched the interaction, his arms crossed. He sighed, shaking his head. Midoriya, you and your mom sure cry a lot, he muttered. Despite his words, a warm feeling spread through his chest. Even if he didn't say it out loud, he was happy for Dekali. The thought of them growing stronger together, side by side, becoming the top heroes of their generation, it was exciting. Not wanting to interrupt the heartfelt moment, he turned and walked away, leaving the mother and daughter to their celebration. The rest of the day passed in a blur for Dekali. She wasn't sure how or when, but eventually, she found herself seated on the couch, absent-mindedly admiring her metallic arm while waiting for dinner. The mouth-watering scent of katsudon filled the air, making her stomach growl. She bounced in place eagerly, her appetite feeling stronger than usual, almost as if she hadn't eaten in days. As she sat there, the initial excitement of awakening her quirk slowly faded. Now, curiosity filled her mind instead. She stared at her transformed hand, flexing her fingers. They moved strangely, uncomfortably, metal scraping against metal, creating a faint squeaking sound with each movement. Mom? Dekali called hesitantly. Yes, honey? Inko's voice rang out from the kitchen, warm and sweet as always. How? How do I turn it off? A brief silence followed. Then, Dekali heard her mother mumble something under her breath. How did she turn it off? Well, there was only one way to find out, they'd have to visit the quirk doctor. Besides, Dekali needed to get her quirk registered anyway. After finishing a delicious dinner, the mother-daughter pair arrived at the doctor's office. The doctor, a kind-looking man with a bushy mustache and a shaved head, observed Dekali with great interest. She sat in a large swiveling chair, her mother standing beside her for support. The doctor leaned in, carefully inspecting her metallic arm. This is certainly a unique quirk, he mused. Typically, transformation or body enhancement type quirks don't manifest this strongly at such a young age. He rubbed his chin thoughtfully. Dekali flushed at the praise, while Inko beamed with pride. The doctor grabbed a clipboard from his desk and studied it. Her quirk factor is quite high, which might explain the strength of the manifestation. But this doesn't seem to be just a simple hardening quirk. Those usually require continuous concentration to maintain, yet Dekali seems to sustain it effortlessly. He turned his attention back to her. Tell me, young lady, what were you thinking when your quirk first activated? Dekali fidgeted in her seat, scratching her metallic hand absent-mindedly. I just wanted to be strong enough to protect Kachan. The doctor raised an eyebrow at the name but didn't comment. I looked around and saw a piece of metal lying nearby. It was the strongest thing I could see, and I wished I could be that tough. The doctor's curiosity deepened. It was common for quirks to awaken through strong emotions, but for a child to manifest a transformation ability based on something in their surroundings? This was something special. Fascinating. He muttered under his breath. He had a theory, one he had to confirm. He pointed toward the metal railings of a nearby medical bed. Dekali, I want you to focus on that metal and think the same thoughts you had when you saved your friend. Just like before, okay? Dekali nodded eagerly. She studied the metal closely, taking in its smooth surface, its color, and its thickness. Taking a deep breath, she focused. And then, the very tips of her fingers on her untransformed hand began to glow. The doctor's eyes widened as he watched flesh and bone gradually disappear, replaced by metal. Dekali's transformation spread up to her first knuckle before stopping abruptly. She leaned forward, breathing heavily, exhaustion evident. The doctor carefully took her transformed hand in his own, lifting his green-tinted goggles for a better look. Amazing, he whispered, before clearing his throat. He turned to Inko. Miss Midoriya, I believe your daughter's quirk is. Before he could finish, Inko suddenly blurted out, Transmutation. Dekali jumped slightly, startled by her mother's sudden outburst. The doctor gave Inko an inquisitive look, silently urging her to explain. Blushing at her enthusiasm, Inko quickly clarified. Her quirk. It's transmutation. She can change her body's composition, transforming it into different materials as long as she understands their chemical structure and shape. The doctor blinked, processing her words. And how do you know this? Inko hesitated, her cheeks reddening further. It was my husband's quirk. Her voice softened as a nostalgic expression crossed her face. Dekali's eyes widened in amazement. The doctor sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. And why didn't you mention this earlier? I didn't think it was the same. My husband had to concentrate to maintain his transformation, but Dekali doesn't. That's why I assumed she had a different enhancement quirk instead. The doctor nodded in understanding. That's quite an interesting mutation. How do you know so much about quirks? Inko bit her lip nervously. My husband. He used to research quirks a lot. After being around him for so long, I picked up a few things. The doctor's expression softened. Why not consult him about Dekali's quirk? At that, both Inko and Dekali's expressions darkened slightly. Sensing the shift in mood, the doctor quickly changed the subject. Never mind that. Now, Dekali, since we've identified your quirk and given it a name, I think we're done here. He ruffled her curly green hair playfully. But doctor, Dekali whined. I still don't know how to turn it off. The doctor chuckled. For most enhancement quirks, relaxing the body helps. But since your case is unique, let's try something different. He smiled reassuringly. Think about how you're safe now. Picture the feeling of your task being complete. Dekali took a deep breath and closed her eyes. Focusing on the doctor's instructions, she imagined herself back home, safe with her mother, her mission over. With a gentle glow, the metallic parts of her body quickly shifted back into soft skin. The doctor grinned, lowering his goggles back over his eyes. As Dekali and her mother left, both standing taller with pride, he leaned back in his chair with a satisfied sigh. Amazing quirk, extraordinary kid. Something tells me I'll be seeing a lot more of her in the future. With that, he pressed the intercom button, calling in his next patient. He paused just short of pressing the button, instead reaching for the clipboard once more. With a swift motion, he pulled out a pen and jotted down a few quick notes at the bottom of the page. He would need to ask the receptionist to mail this to the Midoriya family. Even if his role was small, he wanted to support the child's growth. The girl had been brought to him as soon as she could speak, and from that moment on, Dekali had dreamed of becoming a hero. It might have been too soon to say for sure, but the sheer determination in her eyes, the unwavering will, told him everything. Dekali was destined for greatness. That much he knew. A small blonde boy found himself standing at the familiar front steps of his friend's house. He hopped up the steps quickly, as he did every day, and practically slammed his fist against the door, hammering at the wooden barrier keeping him from his friend. Coming. A cheerful, feminine voice called out. Within seconds, the door swung open, revealing a slightly disheveled Inko. Her hair was messier than usual, and the stained apron around her waist made it clear that Bakugo had interrupted her while she was in the middle of cooking breakfast. Her face brightened at the sight of the boy. Hey, Baku-chan. She greeted warmly, leaning over to ruffle his hair. Normally, Bakugo hated when people touched his hair, he didn't even let his own relatives get away with it. But Inko Obasan was different. Everything about her radiated warmth, from the kindness in her smile to the gentle way she treated him. It made him feel, well, nice. He decided he'd allow it. Just this once. Of course, he made this decision every single day, but that was beside the point. Dekali is inside, she exclaimed, her voice carrying the same warmth as her smile. Then, her face suddenly shifted to worry as she fussed over the small boy. Are you hungry? She asked. I was just about to finish making breakfast. Was he hungry? Absolutely. He had been so excited to play with Dekali and test out their quirks that he had completely forgotten to eat. But was he about to admit that? No way. I already ate, he lied. Inko didn't believe him for a second. Bakugo. Her tone carried soft disappointment. He groaned and muttered, fine. Immediately, her concerned expression melted into a delighted smile. Come on in. Well, Bakugo thought as he entered, Dekali looks awful. She had dark, deep bags under her eyes, her green hair was even messier than usual, and her normally bright complexion was unusually pale. Not to mention, she seemed to be staring off into the distance, her eyes unfocused and hazy. Bakugo could swear she even looked thinner than she had yesterday. What happened to you? He asked bluntly. Oh. Dekali's eyes lit up in recognition. Hey, Kachan. I've been staring at you for 5 minutes, waiting for you to notice me. What happened? Well, since I manifested my quirk yesterday, I've been trying all night to activate it again. But it takes forever just to get my fingertips to transform, and even then, it drains me a lot. So, I went online and started researching quirks, especially enhancement quirks and how they work. It helped a little, but not much. I managed to summon it slightly faster, and the more I practiced, the easier it got, but it takes a ton of energy, and now I'm super hungry, and it's probably going to take forever before I eat. Nerd. Bakugo interrupted, his crimson eyes sparking with irritation. Dekali stopped mid-ramble. You're mumbling. Again. Dekali blushed, rubbing the back of her head sheepishly. Even the redness in her cheeks looked a little pale. Sorry. You know how I get. Repeat. Slower, Bakugo demanded. I spent all night practicing my quirk and didn't sleep. Bakugo threw his hands in the air. Why couldn't you just say that in the first place? Didn't you? Dekali stuttered. Didn't I what? Practice your quirk. No? And you want to be a hero? Idiot. What did you say, Dekali? You can't be a hero without practice, Bakugo. I'll show you, Dekali. Bakugo extended his palm toward her, tiny explosions sparking in his hands. Dekali immediately clenched a fist, the tips of her fingers beginning to glow. Boys! Breakfast is ready. Inko's voice rang out from the kitchen. Both of their stomachs growled in unison. They narrowed their eyes at each other, pointing accusing fingers. Later, they both muttered, before dashing off to the kitchen. A few years later. Dekali's heart pounded as she was carefully guided to her destination. Her veins pulsed in her neck, a mixture of anticipation and nervousness coursing through her. Her birthday presents had never required this much preparation before, but her mother had deemed it necessary to blindfold her before leading her to the surprise. That meant it had to be something special. She fought the urge to rip off the fabric covering her eyes, knowing her mother would be upset. Inko had only led her a few steps from the living room when Dekali accidentally bumped her foot against something, a wooden step. The excitement far outweighed the pain, so she barely flinched. Her mother let out a quick apology, but the enthusiasm in her voice was unmistakable. She was just as excited as Dekali. Carefully, they ascended the stairs. A few moments later, Dekali felt her mother's grip tighten on her shoulders, signaling her to stop. She heard the faint sound of metal clinking against metal, followed by the familiar sound of a lock clicking open. Her mother nudged her forward, guiding her into the room. There was a pause, then the blindfold was yanked away. Dekali blinked rapidly as her eyes adjusted. When she finally focused, what she saw took her breath away. It was a study, one she had never entered before. A large mahogany desk sat at the far end of the room, still lined with papers, books, and a few notebooks. A well-crafted fountain pen rested beside a small metallic ink holder, its contents long dried. Mahogany bookshelves lined the walls, filled with books of various sizes. Some were newer, while others were old, their leather-bound covers worn with time. Dekali's eyes sparkled as she skimmed over the titles. Quirk Theory. Quirks and Biology. She hurried to the desk, flipping through the stack of notebooks. At the very top, one title caught her attention, Quirk, Transmutation. Her quirk. She gasped, then turned to her mother with wide, gleaming eyes. Inko smiled, eyes glistening with unshed tears. Happy 8th birthday, Izu-chan tilde. Dekali practically tackled her mother into a hug, holding onto her tightly. After a few minutes of hugging, and crying, because they were Midoriyas, Inko left her alone in the study. With a bounce in her step, Dekali made her way to the black leather chair, cradling the notebook in her hands. She set it gently on the desk, handling it as if it were the most precious treasure in the world. Taking a deep breath, she flipped it open. At the very top of the first page, one word was written in bold strokes. Transmutation. Her father's handwriting was neat, simple, almost mechanical, yet filled with tiny imperfections only she would notice. A smudge here, a faded ink streak there. She smiled softly. She was going to learn everything she could. The quirk hue shift granted its user the ability to alter minor aspects of their appearance, primarily limited to the color of their hair, eyes, nails, and skin. However, this ability required continuous concentration and metabolism to maintain its effects. Over time, quirks evolved, often merging in offspring. In one such case, creation had undergone a mutation, restricting its effect to the user's own body. Unfortunately, the inherited downside of requiring constant focus remained unchanged. The green-haired girl raised an eyebrow in curiosity. Something didn't seem right. She didn't have to concentrate to maintain her quirk, only when actively transmuting a part of her body. Had her quirk mutated? It was improbable but not impossible. Quirks naturally changed and developed as they were passed down through generations, becoming more complex and challenging to control. The Yaoyorozu and Todoroki families were clear examples of this evolution. Long ago, the renowned creation quirk had only been capable of producing raw, unrefined minerals from the body. Similarly, the Todoroki family's lineage traced back to much simpler origins. It was difficult to believe that Endeavor's powerful ability had once been an ordinary fire-breathing quirk 6 or so generations ago. However, quirk evolution took time, and it wasn't as if Decali's ability had become entirely different from her father's. Rather, it was a variation of the same fundamental power. She shook off her thoughts and continued reading. Transmutation. This ability allows the user to transform their own body into various non-organic materials. Similar to creation, the process requires knowledge of the exact chemical composition of the intended material to transmute successfully. That made sense, Decali thought. At the very least, she wouldn't have to worry about accidentally growing a second head. She was already well aware of the quirk's requirements. Countless nights had been spent studying the composition of different materials, mostly metals, and conducting small experiments to refine her ability. This ability reconfigures the body's fat cells, consuming them in the process. It also requires sustained focus and metabolism to remain active. Decali's interest deepened. There were clear distinctions between her father's quirk and her own, but fundamentally, they were the same ability. She realized she needed to document her own findings. However, rather than risk marking her father's meticulously organized notebook with her own rushed handwriting, she slipped out of the leather chair and quickly retrieved a blank notebook and an All Might-themed pencil. Her hands trembled, not from nervousness, but from excitement. Carefully, she pressed the graphite tip to the fresh cover page and began writing. Transmutation, version 2. The title was simple but effective, at least in her 8-year-old mind. Before jotting down her observations, she returned to her father's notebook, eager to continue where she had left off. The transmutation process becomes increasingly time-consuming and energy-intensive as the complexity of the material increases. While minor transformations may be instantaneous, more intricate modifications can take several seconds. This delay may prove disadvantageous in combat situations. Decali frowned. This was yet another notable difference. Her father could transmute complex structures in mere seconds, whereas she required minutes and nearly all of her stamina just to convert a single limb into metal. Sure, once transmutation was complete, she no longer needed to focus on maintaining it. Still, she couldn't help but envy his efficiency. Another difference to write down, she muttered to herself absent-mindedly. The transmutation quirk offers remarkable versatility, enabling the user to replicate the effects of certain other quirks through mechanical adaptation. For instance, enhanced speed could be simulated by integrating propulsion mechanisms into one's limbs, while durability could be increased by reinforcing the skin with metal. Decali's eyes widened with curiosity. Hardening? Like the pro-hero Crimson Riot? She already understood the advantages of strengthening a limb. It provided both defensive and offensive benefits. However, the idea of limiting reinforcement to the skin alone? She nearly smacked herself for not realizing such a possibility sooner. She raised her palm, closed her eyes, and focused. Moments later, small patches of polished silver metal surfaced in the center of her hands, resembling droplets of spilled ink against her tan skin. Her eyes snapped open, a wide grin spreading across her face. She tapped the hardened patches with her other hand, delighted by the distinct click of metal meeting metal. It was still clumsy and slow, but it was progress. Once she mastered it, reinforcing her body in small increments could prove far more efficient than fully transmuting an entire limb. Wait. If her quirk allowed her to mimic other abilities through structural modifications, could she replicate Kachan's quirk? All she needed was to determine the chemical composition of nitroglycerin. With enough practice, she could potentially alter her sweat to match the explosive properties of Katsuki's. She wouldn't be able to ignite it at will, but that was just a minor setback. Given time, she could figure out a workaround. Decali eagerly continued reading, but much to her disappointment, the analysis concluded after only a few pages. That was it? If this was all there was to transmutation, then what had compelled her father to fill an entire notebook with notes? Her curiosity piqued, she flipped through the pages. To her amazement, each section contained detailed, hand-drawn illustrations, well-polished sketches accompanied by concise explanations. Her eyes widened. The notebook had nearly 100 pages, and every single one contained meticulously crafted diagrams. She stopped at the center of the book. Quirk Mimic, Air Cannon. The accompanying sketch depicted the internal structure of a mechanized arm, complete with labeled components. A thick metallic tube extended through the forearm and protruded from the palm. Her father had even included rough measurements and material specifications. She swallowed. This was far too advanced for her. Just transmuting her arm into solid metal was exhausting enough. The prospect of incorporating intricate moving parts seemed impossible, at least for now. Yet, the sheer creativity and intelligence her father had displayed in designing such concepts left her in awe. Determined, she flipped through the pages again, searching for something more manageable, an idea that could serve as a stepping stone toward mastering her quirk. 1 year later. Bright green eyes fluttered open at the sound of an alarm clock. Yawning, Dickley reached over and silenced the beeping before stretching with a cheerful groan. She hopped out of bed, landing silently on the wooden floor before eagerly beginning her morning routine. Each day followed a simple pattern: wake up, shower, brush her teeth, enjoy a nutritious breakfast prepared by her mother, and then head out to meet Katsuki for a morning run before school. Convincing Katsuki to exercise had been no easy task, but she had managed to persuade him by explaining how physical training directly enhanced their quirks. She had learned this nearly a year ago from one of her father's notebooks, which emphasized the importance of a proper diet and consistent exercise in maintaining quirk efficiency. Today felt like any other day, until she noticed something unusual. The house was eerily silent. There was no sound of breakfast cooking, no quiet humming of her mother tidying the house. A creeping sense of unease settled over her. Had something happened? She immediately abandoned her routine and dashed through the house in search of her mother. The kitchen was untouched. Last night's dishes remained in the sink. The living room was empty. Heart pounding, she rushed upstairs and pushed open her mother's bedroom door. There, she found her mother curled up on the bed, shaking as she clutched a pillow. Her shoulders trembled, and faint sobs filled the quiet room. Dickley hesitated. "Mom?" she asked softly, stepping forward. No response. "Mom?" Her voice rose in alarm as she reached out. Her mother jolted at the touch, startled. Puffy, red-rimmed eyes gazed up at her daughter, and fresh tears began to spill once more. "Izuku," her mother choked out before pulling her into a tight embrace. "Mom, what happened?" Tears streamed down her mother's face as she whispered. "Your father is in a coma." It didn't make any sense. The man her mother had spoken so fondly of? A villain. The man who had given her life? A villain. The man she had admired and hoped to emulate? A villain. The words echoed in Dickley's mind like a relentless mantra. Villain. She had spent countless hours analyzing this man's research and studying his quirk theories, this villain's research. Her quirk? The quirk of a villain. The thought unsettled her. It was difficult to accept that the very ability she had been born with came from someone who stood against everything she believed in. Her emotions swirled: confusion, sadness, rejection, but above all, anger. She was angry at her father for many things, but mostly, she was angry at herself. How could she have spent so much time chasing the shadow of a villain while calling All Might her idol? She shook her head bitterly. It had been weeks since her mother revealed the truth, and she hadn't set foot in her father's study since. Of course, she had already absorbed most of the knowledge from that room, every detailed transmutation, every quirk analysis. From telescoping limbs to the advanced air cannon, she had memorized it all. But now, after discovering the truth about her father, she had no desire to continue down that path. She wanted nothing to do with him. Nothing to do with his research. That determination led her here, standing outside a well-known gadget shop that catered to heroes. The sign, glowing in bright neon pink, read Hatsume's Babies. A few months ago, she had realized she could replicate gadgets using her quirk. But at the time, she had brushed the idea aside, too focused on her father's notebooks. Why bother with gadgets when she had access to a mechanical encyclopedia at home? Now, she was ready to take a different approach. Taking a deep breath, she pushed the door open. Immediately, she was met with a bright and cheerful voice. "Welcome to Hatsume's Babies, Tilda." Dickley's gaze landed on the woman who had spoken. She was middle-aged, about her mother's age, with vibrant pink hair that almost matched the neon sign outside. Her outfit was a bit disheveled, and a pair of deep brown goggles rested on her forehead. A cheerful smile stretched across her face, her golden eyes filled with curiosity as she observed Dickory. Absent-mindedly, she smoothed out her heavy blacksmith apron. Dickory felt her face grow warm under the woman's intense gaze. Shyly, she stepped closer to the counter, her signature red sneakers shuffling together awkwardly. Hi, she stammered. She had mostly trained herself out of stuttering, but meeting new people still made her nervous. Welcome. The woman beamed, motioning for her to come closer. So, how can I help you? Dickory hesitated. Are you, She trailed off, looking up at her expectantly. The owner? The woman practically sang. Yes. And the main gadget creator here. She announced proudly, puffing up her chest. Dickory nodded, then looked down at her feet, nervously brushing her sneakers together. Hey, are you looking for any assistance? She blurted out, the faintest trace of a stutter in her words. The woman's eyebrows shot up in surprise, nearly disappearing behind her goggles. Hatsume Aiko hadn't been expecting that. Young visitors were rare in her shop, and most who did stop by just wanted to see the cool gadgets. Not that she minded, she loved showing off her creations. But for a child, one younger than her own daughter, to ask for an assistant position? Curiosity sparked in her mind. Why? She asked simply, her voice laced with intrigue. Dickory immediately understood the question. She hesitated, searching for the right words, but ultimately, she let out a quiet sigh. Instead of speaking, she raised her hand, palm facing outward. Aiko's eyes widened as the tips of Dickory's fingers began to glow. For a moment, the pink-haired woman simply watched, fascinated. As Dickory focused, her flesh and skin slowly transformed, replaced by gleaming silver metal. It wasn't just an enhancement. Aiko could see it, thanks to her own quirk. She could zoom in and analyze the intricate details of the transformation. The dimensions of Dickory's fingers had subtly changed, while her knuckles and joints had been entirely replaced with mechanical components. Yet, despite the modifications, she moved her fingers as naturally as before. A wide grin spread across Aiko's face. It's my quirk. Dickory muttered, blushing under her intense gaze. I can transform my body into anything mechanical, as long as I understand how it's made. Aiko's mind raced with possibilities. Oh, this is amazing. She thought excitedly. If Dickory's quirk worked the way she suspected, the potential was limitless. And best of all? Dickory already had a solid understanding of mechanics. That meant less time teaching the basics and more time creating. Her head snapped around so fast that Dickory worried she had hurt herself. May. Aiko called toward the back of the shop. A loud boom echoed in response, followed by a plume of smoke from a small doorway leading to the back room. Coming. A younger voice replied. Seconds later, a girl around Dickory's age burst through the door, covered in soot from head to toe, and was that her hair on fire? Casually, the girl patted out the small flames and giggled to herself. Pushing her goggles up, she studied Dickory with an intense gaze. Aiko turned back to her. Meet your new partner, she announced. The younger girl's eyes lit up with excitement. With a squeal, she rushed forward and practically tackled Dickory into a tight hug. Hello, new best friend. She cheered. Dickory gasped as the air was squeezed out of her lungs but couldn't help smiling. Well. This had gone better than she expected. The following day. Dickory exhaled softly, her breath uneven as she pushed herself up from the floor, her arms trembling with exertion. The strain in her forearms and biceps intensified as she completed her 20th push-up, only to falter and collapse onto the ground. Despite her failure to complete another repetition, a sense of accomplishment filled her chest. Months ago, she could barely manage 2 push-ups before exhaustion took over, but now, she had increased her endurance nearly tenfold. Her progress was gradual, but undeniable. She had come to realize that maintaining her quirk required more than just practice, it demanded a strong physique. Running alone wasn't enough. She needed to strengthen her core, enhance her arm strength, and build endurance in her legs. Initially, she hadn't noticed how much weight came with transmuting her flesh into metal. In the beginning, she could only transform small patches of skin or, with great effort, an entire hand. But as she experimented with denser and sturdier metals, she quickly understood the burden of carrying that extra weight. If she wanted to use her quirk effectively, she had to be physically strong enough to support it. With a sigh, she shook off her thoughts. She had almost lost track of time again. Breakfast would be over soon, and she didn't want to be late, especially if it meant frustrating Katsuki again. Their morning runs had become routine, and he would certainly be annoyed if she delayed them. Hurrying downstairs, she skipped the last 2 steps, drawn in by the enticing aroma of her mother's cooking. As always, her mother had prepared a hearty breakfast, ensuring Dickley had the energy she needed. Ever since receiving a doctor's note about her increased metabolism, her mother had taken extra care to provide meals rich in nutrients. Dickley required a significantly higher caloric intake than her peers to maintain the efficiency of her quirk. That meant breakfast was always a carefully prepared spread, boiled eggs, grilled fish, a generous serving of vegetables, and a steaming bowl of rice. Surprisingly, she had no trouble finishing every bite. The doctor's recommendation had proven effective. Since adjusting her diet, Dickley noticed a marked improvement in her transmutation speed and the durability of her transformations. After slipping on her signature red sneakers, she pressed a quick kiss to her mother's forehead before stepping outside. With a warm smile, her mother handed her 2 bottles, one filled with ice-cold water, and the other containing raw honey. Yes, honey. Somehow, her mother had discovered that keeping a bottle of honey on hand prevented the dizzy spells Dickley frequently experienced. Apparently, her blood sugar dropped more often than usual, and regular intake of honey helped keep her energy levels stable. Many found it odd when they saw her carrying a water bottle filled with honey to school, but she had no choice. Her quirk required constant use, whether actively training or passively reinforcing her skin's transmutation beneath her long-sleeved uniform. She was determined to make the process second nature, as effortless as breathing. At times, she felt a tinge of envy toward Katsuki. His quirk was straightforward, he simply had to oxidize his sweat to generate explosions. Not only was it easy to activate, but it was incredibly powerful. He had even figured out how to propel himself short distances using his explosions, a skill Dickley couldn't help but admire. By the age of 9, Katsuki had already refined his abilities to the point of using them both offensively and defensively. Dickley had even helped him develop Stun Grenade, a controlled explosion that produced a blinding flash to disorient opponents. Katsuki rarely trained deliberately, he considered his quirk perfect as it was. Meanwhile, Dickley devoted every spare moment to improving her own abilities, yet her progress felt frustratingly slow. She had mastered transforming her entire arm and had made slight advances in turning her skin metallic, but she still had a long way to go. Despite this, she refused to be discouraged. She had a dream, to become a hero. No matter the challenges ahead, she was determined to prove that she could achieve her goal. 3 years later. Hatsume Aiko barely reacted as a loud explosion echoed through her workshop. Her ears rang momentarily, but she merely shook her head, a faintly exasperated expression crossing her face. "Are you two okay back there?" she called out, flipping through a gadget magazine at the counter. She didn't even glance toward the source of the smoke rising from the back of the shop. By now, she was used to such incidents. "Yeah," came the synchronized reply, followed by a series of muffled coughs. The cause of the explosion? May had decided to experiment with a speed-enhancing device, a metallic brace that attached to the wearer's calves, using bursts of compressed air to increase movement speed. Unfortunately, in her relentless pursuit of improvement, May had swapped out the standard compressed oxygen with nitrous oxide. Dickley barely had time to react before May inserted a tiny canister of the flammable gas into the device and activated it. The gadget, designed to handle only oxygen, couldn't withstand the unexpected combustion, and it promptly exploded. "You are unbelievable," Dickley muttered with a sigh, brushing soot off the heavy red goggles she wore. May merely grinned, her own brown goggles equipped with small built-in wipers that frantically cleared away the soot. She let out a loud, delighted laugh and threw an arm around Dickley's shoulder, pulling her close. "We never would have known if we hadn't tried." Dickley looked incredulous. "Yes, we absolutely could have," she argued, her frustration evident. Before she could continue, May silenced her with a finger to her lips. "No arguing, Tilda," May sang teasingly. "We've got more gadgets to make." She tossed Dickley a metallic wrist strap, her grin never faltering. Dickley caught it swiftly, her transformed metallic hand clinking against the steel device. She raised an eyebrow. "Let me guess, you want to shove a stick of dynamite in this one?" she quipped sarcastically. May rolled her golden eyes. "No, genius. I need you to adjust it," she said, her enthusiasm unwavering. With a resigned sigh, Dickley focused on the wrist strap. The tip of her index finger glowed softly before reshaping into a fine rod with a screwdriver tip. Without hesitation, she began making precise adjustments. May, as always, watched in fascination. No matter how often she saw Dickley transmute her limbs, it never ceased to amaze her. "Good toolbox, Tilda," May teased, playfully patting Dickley's shoulder. Though the nickname annoyed her to no end, Decali couldn't deny that May had become one of her closest friends and an invaluable creative partner. The pair spent several more hours tinkering, thankfully avoiding further explosions. Decali's knowledge of mechanics and constant research, combined with May's innovative mind and hands-on expertise, made them a highly productive duo. Years ago, Decali barely knew how to handle a screwdriver properly. Now, she could deconstruct and reassemble gadgets in minutes. While Izuku still didn't allow her to repair equipment brought in by professional heroes, she took the time to teach Decali about each component in detail. Time flew by when Decali and May worked together. Before they knew it, Izuku was closing up shop, and Decali had to bid farewell to the mother-daughter duo for the evening. As she walked home, she smiled to herself. Every day brought new challenges, but each one also brought her closer to her goal. She was getting stronger. She was getting better. And one day, she would be a hero. The following day, two young martial artists stood on opposite ends of a spacious tatami mat, their seasoned mentor standing between them, gripping a well-worn bow staff in one hand. He was dressed in a traditional, loose-fitting kimono, the deep black fabric mirroring the intensity of his sharp gaze. Though his head was completely bald, his impressive, thick beard more than compensated, tapering to a point just past his collar. He absent-mindedly stroked his beard as he studied the two fighters, a blonde boy and a green-haired girl. Observing the way their muscles tensed in anticipation, he tapped his bow staff against the ground once before stepping back, his experienced eyes carefully analyzing their movements. Katsuki wasted no time, immediately lunging forward in a full sprint, aiming to close the distance. Decali, however, remained composed, taking only a few calculated steps forward. She knew Katsuki's fighting style well, he always initiated combat the same way. As expected, Katsuki threw a powerful overhead punch. Decali swiftly sidestepped, countering with an open palm strike to his stomach. The blonde barely flinched, pivoting smoothly on his axis before launching a spinning roundhouse kick. Decali raised both arms in defense, but the force of the impact still pushed her back. Unyielding, Katsuki pressed forward, refusing to give her a moment to recover. He spun again, this time targeting her face with another roundhouse kick. Instead of blocking, Decali leaned back just enough to avoid the strike, quickly shifting her weight and sweeping Katsuki's leg out from under him. He let out a frustrated grunt as he fell but caught himself on his hands, executing a quick back roll to regain his footing. A smirk formed on both fighters' faces as they circled each other, stepping lightly, testing the other's movements. This time, it was Decali who made the first move. She leapt into the air, mimicking Katsuki's earlier attack, and delivered a sharp spinning roundhouse kick straight to his face. Katsuki barely had time to react. His eyes widened in shock, realizing too late that she had taken the initiative for once. The impact sent him stumbling back before he crashed onto the mat. Their mentor let out an impressed whistle. He hadn't expected that. Not bad, he mused, his eyes twinkling with approval. Katsuki groaned, sitting up while rubbing his cheek. Seriously? Nerd actually got a hit in. He grumbled. Ignoring the complaint, their mentor continued his evaluation. Midoriya, he addressed Decali, your defensive techniques are solid, but you're still relying too much on overanalyzing. Trust your instincts, let your muscle memory guide you. Decali flushed slightly, rubbing the back of her head. She had heard this advice plenty of times before. That being said, the mentor continued, that was an excellent strike. It's good to see you're finally taking the initiative. A proud smile crept onto Decali's face, though she quickly composed herself as the mentor turned to Katsuki. And you, hothead. Katsuki scowled at the nickname but said nothing. He knew better than to challenge their mentor, who, despite being quirkless, could still defeat them effortlessly. How many times do I have to tell you to slow down? The mentor sighed, shaking his head. Your speed makes you unpredictable, but it also leaves too many openings. Take a moment to think before you act. Katsuki begrudgingly nodded. He had been told this before, but thinking before attacking was easier said than done when he thrived on adrenaline. With a decisive tap of the bow staff, the mentor signaled for them to rise. Both fighters got back to their feet, still clutching their bruised cheeks. Almost in sync, they reset their stances, preparing for another round. Later that night, Mitsuki Bakugo barely flinched when she heard her son shouting a string of colorful words loud enough to wake the entire neighborhood. What did surprise her, however, was the lack of an explosion following the outburst. That alone made her raise an eyebrow. Still comfortably seated on the couch, she remained fixated on her favorite late-night drama. The TV flickered in the dimly lit room as she lazily glanced at the clock. 1:30 a.m. Her brow twitched. What in the world was that boy yelling about at this hour? If he had woken Dikali, who was staying over, Mitsuki was going to have words with him. Worse, if he had disturbed his father, who had an early morning shift, Katsuki was in for an earful. Sighing, she slipped on her favorite pink fuzzy slippers and marched up the stairs, her footsteps deliberately heavy against the wooden panels. If her son hadn't woken anyone up yet, she certainly would at this rate. Without hesitation, she kicked open his door. Katsuki, what in the... She stopped mid-rant, momentarily caught off guard by the scene before her. Instead of causing chaos, Katsuki was hunched over a sketchbook, furiously scribbling something down. Dikali sat beside him, looking just as engrossed in the process. Their faces were lit by the dim glow of a desk lamp, and a pile of crumpled papers surrounded them. Mitsuki squinted. Were those hero costume designs? Her irritation faded, replaced by curiosity. She had spent years listening to Katsuki rant about becoming the greatest hero, and now he was finally designing his own costume? She was almost tempted to gush over it, but she had to uphold her role as the responsible adult. Keep it down. She barked before turning on her heel to leave. Just as she reached the door, she paused, glancing back over her shoulder. And show me what you come up with when you're done. Both teens flashed her wide grins before she shut the door behind her. Hero costume brainstorming. A belt filled with grenades? Dikali mused, raising an eyebrow as she examined Katsuki's design. She tapped her chin and thought. Actually, that could work. If we attach a pump system, you could store your sweat inside them as fuel for controlled explosions. It would even extract excess nitroglycerin from your body. Katsuki smirked. So you're saying I'm a genius? More like you accidentally had a good idea, she teased. Shut it, Dikali. She ignored him and continued sketching. Now, about your gauntlets. Katsuki perked up. Oh. Yeah. I was thinking of storing all my sweat in one big chamber and... Dikali frowned. That's inefficient. Excuse me? She quickly flipped to a fresh page and began sketching. Instead of storing all your sweat in one place for a single explosion, why not divide it into multiple smaller shots? Katsuki leaned in, watching as she drew a streamlined gauntlet fitted with small detachable canisters. These mini rockets can store your sweat and either be used for close-range blasts or launched for long-range attacks, she explained. Katsuki stared at the design, his eyes practically sparkling. That is awesome. Dikali smirked. Told you. The brainstorming session stretched on, the two refining ideas, improving each other's designs, and excitedly discussing their future hero personas. By the time they were finally satisfied with their work, sunlight had begun filtering through the curtains. Without a second thought, both teens collapsed onto the floor, exhaustion overtaking them. Their designs were finished. And for the first time, their dreams of becoming heroes felt more real than ever. 2 years later. Dikali was deep in thought, a calloused hand gripping a pencil as she carefully sketched out yet another transmutation design. She had mastered the process months ago, now able to flawlessly execute every blueprint she created. She had trained relentlessly, perfecting countless transmutations. Her greatest achievement? A technique she called Boost, inspired by the pro-hero Ingenium's Quirk. Instead of placing the boosters near the triceps like Ingenium's, she positioned them lower, near her calves, allowing for a more natural and controlled burst of speed. The idea stemmed from a gadget May had once built, and inevitably blown up, as she often did. Through rigorous training, Dikali had also discovered that she could transmute non-organic objects. The realization came by accident. She had been so engrossed in sketching a new gadget that she hadn't noticed her quirk activating subconsciously. It wasn't until the pencil in her hand transformed into a steel tube, tearing through the page, that she realized what had happened. Despite this discovery, she had not pursued it further. Transmuting her own body had become second nature due to her familiarity with it. Transforming her arms required little effort, while her legs took slightly more energy but remained manageable. However, transmuting an external object, even as small as a pencil, was so draining that it nearly exhausted her completely. She had theories about why this was the case, but none seemed entirely convincing. Ultimately, the ability to transmute non-living objects remained a mystery, one she chose not to explore further due to its excessive energy demands. Lost in thought, Dikali didn't notice the teacher calling her name, nor the general uproar in the classroom. A sudden explosion snapped her attention back to reality. She turned to see Katsuki, who was glaring at her with an irritated expression. Stop mumbling, nerd, he muttered. Oh. She had been thinking out loud again. Soft chuckles echoed throughout the classroom, but they were quickly silenced by another explosion. Katsuki had slammed his hands onto the desk, the blast leaving scorch marks on its surface. "Enough laughing, extras," he declared, his voice filled with confidence. The room fell silent as their classmates turned to look at him, eyes filled with a mix of admiration and intimidation. "Laugh all you want," he continued, "but none of you are as strong as we are." He wasn't wrong. Over the years, the two had trained rigorously, pushing their limits. Dakali had grown significantly, now standing just over 6 feet tall, while Katsuki was only a couple of inches shorter. She attributed the difference to her strict diet and intense training, something Katsuki hadn't focused on as much since his quirk didn't demand it. The green-haired girl spoke calmly. "We both aced UA's mock exam. While the rest of you did nothing," Katsuki added with a smirk. The two exchanged a fist bump, sharing a knowing grin. They had spent their lives preparing for this moment, and nothing would stand in their way. A sudden encounter. Dakali's red sneakers thudded against the pavement as she walked home, lost in thought as usual. Her mind raced through countless ideas, ways to improve her transmutations, methods to build devices faster, new metal alloys to test. She was so preoccupied that she didn't notice the manhole beneath her foot shift slightly. However, she did notice when it was suddenly launched into the air, slamming into the ceiling of the underpass with enough force to crack the concrete. She instinctively raised her hands into a defensive stance, prepared for anything. There was no time to transmute anything complex, so she settled for hardening her skin. A void-like blackness spread across her fingertips, rapidly consuming her arms like fire. Within seconds, both were covered in a metallic sheen, stopping just below her biceps. She wasn't prepared for what happened next. A massive surge of green, rancid sludge erupted from the sewer, moving toward her like a tidal wave. She turned and ran. Adrenaline surged through her body, fueling her muscles. But no matter how much she pushed herself, she wasn't fast enough. A thick mass of sludge struck the base of her neck, knocking her off balance. She tumbled onto the pavement, sharp pain shooting through her body as small scrapes and friction burns formed across her skin. Before she could scramble to her feet, the weight of the villain pressed down on her back, pinning her in place. A deep, unsettling laugh echoed in her ears. Finally. A fitting vessel. Don't struggle. It'll only take a moment. Liquid forced its way into her mouth and nostrils, cutting off her air supply. Her lungs burned as she choked, struggling to breathe. Was this it? Was this how it ended? All her years of training, all the effort she had poured into her dream, was it all for nothing? Her hands clawed at her face, but the sludge tightened its grip, preventing her from moving. Fear, anger, and desperation flooded her mind. Then, finally, acceptance. Tears welled in her eyes as her strength faded. "I'm sorry. Mom." Her vision blurred. Darkness crept in. Then. Smash. A powerful shockwave tore through the air. The next thing she knew, she was airborne, slamming into a nearby wall. Pain pulsed through her body, but she was breathing. She was alive. Slowly, she opened her eyes, expecting to see the villain attacking again. Instead, a towering figure stood before her, exuding confidence. Dakali recognized the grin anywhere. The symbol of peace. The #1 hero. All Might. Her heart pounded in disbelief. All, she stammered. All Might. He finished with a laugh, striking his signature pose. "It's all right now." "Why?" "Because I am here." Dakali sprang to her feet, feeling an overwhelming wave of emotions. Relief, admiration. Doubt? For the first time in years, uncertainty gnawed at her resolve. Could she truly become a hero? "All Might," she blurted, eyes desperate for reassurance. "Do you think I can be a hero?" "Of course," he replied without hesitation. But before he could say more, he prepared to leave, intending to hand the villain over to the authorities. Before she could stop herself, Dakali latched onto him. Wait," she shouted as they soared into the sky. All Might paled as he noticed her clinging to his leg, forced to make an emergency landing on a nearby rooftop. As they caught their breath, she looked down, ashamed. "All Might," she whispered. "Even if my father is a villain?" A heavy silence followed. Then, without warning, All Might coughed, his muscular form deflating into that of a thin, sickly-looking man. Dakali's eyes widened in shock. "All Might?" With a sigh, he explained his condition, the injury that limited his hero time. When he finished, He placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. It doesn't matter who your father is, he said firmly. You can still be a hero, as long as you have the heart and determination for it. A small smile broke through her tears. A new resolve burned in her chest. She would become a hero, no matter what. Dear YouTube family, I hope you had a great time watching. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to support the channel. Best regards. 6th Path Weeb.